Hey everybody, welcome back to the SuperBake podcast. I'm your host, Baker. Let's talk about stuff. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. So today, I wanted to talk about the game Tales of Arise for the PlayStation 5, the newest game in the Tales series, and one of my longtime favorite series. So yeah, I played this game a few weeks ago, finally beat it. It took a little bit longer than I intended. Pretty long game overall, but yeah, I just want to give my overall thoughts and opinions on this game. So the story basically is the story takes place on this world called Dana. And there's two worlds basically, Dana and Rena. Rena is the more technologically advanced of the two worlds, and essentially has enslaved the people of Dana to essentially do their bidding. So in the game, there's a Danan resistance that is essentially trying to fight back against the Renan oppressors. And you play as the main character Alphen and Shion, as well as a few other characters, and you join the Danan resistance against the Renan occupation. You go across it's like I think 5 different areas in the game. There's the scorching volcanic land of Calaglia, the frozen wasteland of Cislodia, the kind of a jungle area of Elda Menancia. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names. The mountain area, there's like a mountain area, and of course like a rainforest as well. So yeah, that's basically the story in a nutshell. Overall, I loved this game. It won like Best RPG at the 2021 Game Awards, and yeah, I can definitely understand why. As far as like if I think it's the best game in the Tales series, I'll kind of go over that a little bit briefly later, but it's definitely one of my personal favorites, and easily one of my, in my opinion, one of the best JRPGs to come out in recent memory. So I'm going to kind of go into that a little bit more as far as like what I thought about it, as well as like some things that maybe I would change or just didn't quite mesh with me. But yeah, I'll go over that here shortly, as well as kind of give my overall thoughts in the game as well. Basically, just a few things that I liked about the game. Number one, definitely the characters of this game. So there's, in most JRPGs, there's the main group of characters that you get to play as. In this game, there's 6 characters. The 2 main ones, who are kind of the main characters of the story, are Alphen, who you spend most of your time playing as well as Shion, the female protagonist of the game. And honestly, probably the main character of the game, too, in my opinion. In many ways, she's kind of the main character. The other characters that join your group are Law, who's kind of like this... He's kind of like the comic relief character of the group, in a way. He's got some badass moments, too, but he joins your group later on. He's kind of like a fisticuffs fighter. You get Renwell, who's like a mage and sort of has like a brother-sister relationship with Law. Kisara, who's like the tank of the group, who is almost kind of like the motherly figure. She's kind of like the older voice of reason in the group. She fights with a almost comically oversized shield, but it's really cool. And then Dohalim, who's kind of the aristocratic character, the more sophisticated character of the group. He's like a Renan lord that joins your group later on in the story, and he fights with like a pole arm. Alphen fights with a sword, as well as the blazing sword in the game, and there's kind of more on that I'll get into a little bit later. And then Shion fights with a rifle that she uses. She uses what's called astral energy in the game to shoot the rifle. Astral energy in this game is kind of like the equivalence of like chakra in Naruto, or energy in Dragon Ball Z or other anime series. It's basically like the energy source that most people use to do their attacks. But yeah, the characters in this game I think are probably one of the biggest selling points, at least for me. The main character Alphen that you play as, I love his introduction in the story. So he's introduced as the character Iron Mask in the beginning because he has an iron mask that covers his entire head, and you can't really see anything, which I thought was a really interesting angle for a main character, especially in a JRPG. I feel like in games like this, you wouldn't normally see that. Most of the time, you kind of see these pretty boy characters And of course, once you see Alphen without his helmet on, he does kind of look like a typical, anime protagonist. But the iron mask was actually an interesting angle for his character, mainly because it's on his head for the first couple hours of the game, and not knowing what he looks like adds a lot of mystery to him, and it really kind of allows his personality to kind of come through a little bit. I don't know. I don't mind when they removed his helmet, but honestly, I kind of felt like once they did, he kind of just feels like your typical like anime JRPG protagonist. But I think that his personality works enough. He's got a strong enough character in the game that I think it works fine. But honestly, my favorite look that he had was either with the mask fully on, or later he gets part of the mask broken off, so part of it still kind of covers, I think it's his right eye. Honestly, I think that would have been cool if they just kind of left that in there, and that was just kind of his look. It was a cool look for him, and it was unique. I hadn't really seen anything quite like that before in a game, so I thought that was interesting. And then, of course, Shion, who I mentioned before, was kind of really in many ways is sort of like the main character of the story. So she is a Renin as well. So, and just to kind of give some clarification on that, Alphen is a Danin, and he was a Danin slave in the beginning of the story, and Shion kind of helps him, break out of his bondage to fight against the Renin lord that's holding him and many other Danins as slaves. Shion reveals that she wants to basically work to take down the Renin lords, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. I think you're probably better playing the game yourself and kind of finding out the story for yourself on that. I just don't want to divulge too much there. It's a Tales game, so there's a lot of story to it, so I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much in this review. I just kind of want to stick to the surface level stuff, just because I'll be here all fucking day talking about it otherwise. But Shion's character, so I really dug her character a lot. So she reminds me a lot of Luke von Fabra from Tales of the Abyss, for any of you out there who may have played that game. That was one of my favorite games in the series. It's like mainly because of the main character Luke. Like, he to me is one of the best characters in the Tales series because he actually has a decent character arc. And Shion in many ways is kind of like that in this game too. Her arc is fantastic. So it's clear from the beginning that because she is a Renin, she looks down on anyone who's a Danin. So like the characters Alphen, Law, Renwell, they're all Renins. And so it's clear that even though Shion kind of looks down on them at first, but she does develop, a closeness with them, a kinship with them because they travel together. And of course, her and Alphen, I don't think I'm giving away too much, do start to develop a romantic relationship with each other. I don't really think that's much of a spoiler. But yeah, like her arc throughout the story, I think is great. And the other characters in the game too, Law, Renwell, Kisara, Dohalim, they're all great too. Dohalim in particular, I really like. He has some really good comedic moments in the story that I think are great. I think he and Shion and Law are probably the two standouts for me. I really enjoyed Law's quips with, like, his relationship with Alphen is great. They have kind of like this brotherly relationship that works really well. And then, of course, his relationship with Renwell is fantastic too. Just their back and forth, their banter with each other is awesome. And I think the English voice actors do a great job with that as well. I haven't listened to the Japanese dub for this game, but when I go back and do a New Game Plus, I'll probably listen to that my second playthrough. But yeah, I think for me, the characters were definitely the biggest selling point for this game. You really can tell that, like, one, the voice actors put a lot of effort into making these feel like really good, fleshed out characters. But two, I think just because you spend so much time with them, like in a typical JRPG, you really do find yourself coming to care about these characters, and you want to see them come out on top and be victorious. Most especially Shion's character, mainly because of the issue that she has in the story. She has like this curse placed upon her where anyone who gets close to her basically gets hurt because of these essentially magic thorns that come out and will basically hurt anybody that gets too close to her. And she's had them her entire life, and because of that, she's never been able to get close to anybody. And this adds for an interesting dynamic between her and the character Alphen, because Alphen, in the story, he can't feel pain. And there's a reason for that, which I'm not going to go into too much because I want anyone who's listening to this to go out there and play the game themselves and experience why, because I think it'll hit harder if you understand the reason why. But basically, Alphen can't feel pain in the story. And so because of that, he's the only person that can actually, like, he can hold Shion's hand. He can actually come into contact with her and not get hurt. And that's a big part in the story, because he is able to use this, what's known as the blazing sword, this really powerful weapon. And even though it burns him, he doesn't feel the pain, so he can use the full power of the sword. Whereas most people, if they even touched it, would shriek in agony. But Alphen is the only person who can use it. So it leads to some interesting moments in the story for him. And again, it adds some intrigue to his character that I really like. And of course, the reasons for that are explored later in the game, and they're pretty good too. But honestly, I think when he has the mask on, I think that's when he's probably his most intriguing, in my opinion. But yeah, the other thing I like about the game is the story overall. They do a good job of making you really care about the characters. Again, mainly Shion and Alphen. You really do root for these two characters. You want to see them come out on top, especially Shion. You really do start to feel sorry for her as the story goes on, seeing the emotional turmoil she's going through because of the curse that's on her. And you can see the arc that she goes through, learning to go from being a callous, Renin who looks down on anybody who's a Danon like Alphen, and eventually coming to respect them and even care about them deeply. And of course, like, the world that you're in, the different areas you go to all feel very distinct. Like the first area you're in, which I just had it written down here. I know I just said it. Forgive me. Calaglia. Like, it's kind of like on the side of a volcano. And so, like, it has its own distinct look. Like, each area has its own distinct look. There's kind of a big open world feel in some places, although for the most part, I would say most areas in the game are pretty confined. You do get some free reign to run around here and there, but it's not like Breath of the Wild or The Witcher or anything like that. It's not one of those games where you have like this big open landscape you can explore. For the most part, I would say most areas are pretty well contained. You do have some freedom on like where you can go and what you can explore, but for the most part, it's pretty linear, I would say. At least I didn't find myself at any point getting lost or not knowing where to go, which there are some RPGs I've played recently where that was definitely the case. I think that I'd made note of that when I think I did a review of Xenoblade 2, and I think I talked about that. So, but yeah, the story is really good. I can say it kept me engaged throughout the majority of the campaign. It is a little bit long though, and I'll kind of get into this a little bit later. I would say the first probably 3/4 of the game are probably the best part of the story. The last quarter of the game, mainly the last few hours, are probably where it starts to teeter off, but I'll kind of get into the reasons why I think for that, or why I feel that way here shortly. Another positive of the game, the music. As always, the soundtrack for Tales games are always top-notch, and this game's no different. Music is great. As far as the battle music in combat, I really like that too. It's got a good feel, it's got a good rush to it, but my favorites are definitely the opening songs they play for the game, the opening cinematic. So every Tales game, they always have like the opening cinematic, which is always fully animated. You do get like little cutscenes that are animated here and there throughout the story, but those are pretty rare for the most part. But the opening cinematic, the songs they play are really good, especially the second song they play, which I need to look up what that song's called. I listened to it on YouTube the other day. I love the beat of it. It's got kind of this sad melody, but like it's so good. Yeah, I love the music of this game. The soundtrack is fantastic. I think I talked about the soundtrack of another JRPG recently, Ys 8, Lacrimosa of Dana, and I think that game has one of the best soundtracks that I've ever heard in a JRPG, but this one's definitely got some good beats too. And then finally, another major positive of this game is definitely the gameplay/combat. I mean, gameplay-wise, when you're not in combat, it's like a typical Tales game. There's not a whole lot to do outside of combat. There are side quests you can do here and there. There's a system you can do where you can like kind of farm for animals and stuff like that, and you can get extra materials out of that for like cooking and stuff, which the cooking in this game I do actually enjoy. You get some you get some decent like bonuses out of it, like buffs you can get, and you get different buffs depending on who makes the meal. I think I always had Alphen cook, but I know you could have other people cook too. But yeah, like that stuff's interesting. There is like some fishing mini games you can do. I'll be honest, I didn't do a whole lot of those, but there is that element as well. But to me, the standout from the gameplay is definitely the combat. This is definitely the best combat, in my opinion, that we've seen out of any Tales game ever. It breaks the mold from the traditional combat that I've seen in previous Tales series. Like I've played, the classics like Symphonia, Tales of the Abyss, Tales of Zestiria, Vesperia, I played most of Tales of Grace's F. I don't think I quite beat that game, but I came pretty close to it. But yeah, like those all had basically around the same type of combat system where, like in a game like Final Fantasy, you come into contact with an enemy, the screen breaks or whatever, and then you're on the battlefield, and you can run around freely for the most part, but you're kind of limited within that little arena that you're supposed to fight in. So you do have that arena in this game, but in this game, you basically have free reign on where you can go during combat. And it's really, it feels like the most fluid combat system that the Tales series has ever had, in my opinion. I mean, really, this game almost doesn't feel like a Tales game in a good way. Like the combat in this one it feels smooth. Like that was kind of one of my concerns, was how different that it looked. Was I was wondering like, okay, is this going to feel like a Tales game? Is it going to play like one? And I can definitely say that it does. It feels like they took everything from the original series and tried to ramp it up in a good way, which I know that was something when they interviewed, I think it's Namco Bandai is the studio that makes the Tales series. I know that they had said, several people from there had said that they really wanted to try to do something new with this game, and I think that they definitely did for sure. The combat feels great. It's fast-paced, and it can be pretty challenging at times too. Like regular enemy encounters, for the most part, I found that I got through all right. But boss fights in this game, there were definitely a few that I got my ass kicked. Like I think it was the third boss, the third Renin Lord, because you have to fight you have to take down like several Renin Lords throughout the game. Like each area that you go to has like a Renin Lord that you have to take on. And the first one I got through okay, the big guy from the volcano. But I think it was the third boss. He was the electric guy. Because like each Renin Lord is kind of like their theme is like an element or something. So like the first guy is like fire. And then the third guy I think was lightning. And he was the guy that it actually took me a couple tries to beat him, because he had this big AoE attack that he did that I couldn't quite figure out for a little bit. And then I finally figured out what to do, and I was able to take him down. But yeah, that was a legitimately difficult fight. And a lot of the boss fights in this game are pretty challenging. But looking back, I think that was pretty normal in this series. So I remember I played the Tales of Vesperia definitive edition on the Switch recently, like within the last year. And yeah, I remember the bosses in that game being relatively difficult too, depending on what difficulty you were on. I think I played it on normal, so I don't look for much of a challenge in my game, so I play on normal, but I'm not afraid to bump it down to easy if I'm getting my ass kicked. I try not to, but well, it just kind of depends. But yeah, and then I like the healing system in this game as well. So in most older games, like every character would have like their own like mana, so that way if they used their moves or whatever, they would use up their own mana. In this game, it's a little bit different. It's like you don't really have mana in this game, at least most of the characters don't. Instead, you kind of get like your own little like, it's like a meter for like how many moves you can use, like your arts essentially. And like each art takes up a certain amount of moves that you have, or notches, I guess. And so like as long as you've got those, like as long as you have like those little notches, you can use as many arts as you want until you run out. And they replenish pretty quickly. But you do have what's called CP in this game, and that essentially is where your healing spells come from. Like Shion is basically your healer in this game. So every time she uses a healing spell, she uses up CP and stuff. It's nice in this game because it kind of feels a little bit more streamlined as far as like healing goes, especially if you need to heal outside of combat. So that's nice. It's a little different. I can see where maybe some people who might not be used to that, it could be a little bit of a change, but it didn't bother me. I honestly kind of liked it and thought it was refreshing. But yeah, the combat in this game is just so much fun. Like You have like a dodge button you can use, which feels very fluid. Your attack and your standard attacks and stuff in this game feel very much like a traditional Tales game, as well as your arts that you use. Like you have arts like Demon Fang and stuff, which feels right at home in this game. I remember that from Tales of Symphonia and Tales of the Abyss and stuff. So yeah, like when you get into the meat and potatoes of the combat in this game, it definitely feels like a traditional Tales game. It just looks different, and the flow of the battle feels different too, but in a good way. You do have like a skill system in this game. There's like a skill panel you can use for each character, so you can kind of develop their skills in different ways if you want to. Like each character kind of has like their own unique set of skills they can learn. Like Law has, and that's kind of the cool thing about this game and the combat system, is that each character has like their own unique ability they can use in combat. That's something that this game does really well that I don't really remember them ever doing in a previous Tales game. In previous entries, like each character kind of has their own special ability they can bring into combat. So like, for example, Shion, because she uses a gun, she's very effective against like flying enemies. So like, for example, like if you're fighting a bunch of like birds that attack you randomly or something like that, she's good against those. Alphen, he has like his blazing sword, so he can use that to do a lot of like large AoE attacks against enemies on the ground. Law can use he has like, I can't remember what it's actually called, but basically he can use his fist to bust through like enemies that have a lot of armor, and Kisara can block enemy attacks and stuff like that because she's the tank of the group. So it's like each character kind of has like their own unique ability that they bring into combat that you can use at certain points to kind of help battles move more in your favor, essentially. So that's really cool. And again, I think that's something that we didn't really see in a lot of previous titles in the series. So I really like that about this game. It definitely feels like they brought a lot of new things to the table to make this feel like its own unique experience. Excuse me. So I think that's definitely one element of this game that a lot of people are going to enjoy. Like if you're a fan of the series, but maybe you're just kind of wishing that they would try to branch out and do something a little different, I think this is going to be right up your alley. So now I've talked about some of the positives of the game, but one thing I want to talk about were a couple of the negatives of this game. So these are really going to be more nitpicks on my part. These aren't really things that I would consider to be game breaking, just little things that I noticed that I personally maybe had a little bit of a problem with. So the first thing is going to be, and this is going to get into relatively heavy spoiler territory, but it's going to be the ending of the game / the final boss. So basically, one of the final bosses of the game is this character named Volran, who I keep wanting to call Voltron. Volran, who is one of the 5 Renin lords that you have to fight. And I think his element is water, if I remember correctly. And I thought he was going to be the final boss of the game, because the game definitely kind of sets it up like he is. Well, he kind of is, but he kind of isn't. It's kind of weird. But instead, it's like the game kind of pulls this bait and switch near the end where they kind of flip it, and there's another final boss that you have to fight. It's like this lady who's dressed in red who seems to be Volran's assistant, but then she shows up and kidnaps Shion. I can't remember if she kidnaps Shion, but she does something. Oh no, she takes this core. I think it's called the Renis Alma. It's like this combination of all these master cores from the different Renin lords, and she takes that and takes it back to the planet of Rena, and you have to go fight her there. And it's like, and then like this big monster shows up, and that's kind of the final boss of the game. But then Volran comes back, and you have to fight him again, and it's like, the final boss was definitely weird. Like I kind of wish that they could have just skipped all that and just made Volran the final boss, and I think it would have flowed better, just because he shows up earlier in the game and you have this brief confrontation with him, like him and Alphen, and there's kind of this whole history between those two, which again I'm not going to get into too much because that's going to take a long time. But yeah, like that's kind of my biggest gripe right now with the game, is just the final boss of the game felt a little underwhelming. I guess I just wanted to see more of like Volran's character, a little bit more of like, I guess, his motivation behind why he was doing what he was doing, and I guess just more of him in general, because he was just an interesting villain, and he was genuinely creepy too. Another kind of disappointment that I had with the game was basically the story between Alphen and Shion. So, like I said before, these are two characters who it's clear in the game that they have a budding romance throughout the story. And again, not going to give, I don't think this is really giving away too much, but they do eventually figure out how to help Shion with her curse. And we don't really get to see much of a resolution with her, and especially like between her and Alphen. It would have been nice to get some closure on that. I mean, we know obviously that they end up together, but it just would have been nice if we could have seen more of that. I guess just because you spend so much time with these two characters, it would have been a nice payoff to see them finally, like to see more of them actually get to spend time together. And I just feel like we never got to see that, and that was a bit of a disappointment. Again, maybe more of a minor nitpick on my part, but just from a story perspective, I guess that's what I wanted. I guess it just goes to show like that's how much I liked those two characters, that I just was rooting for them. Another gripe I had was the final dungeon in general. It felt like it really dragged on for a long time. Like, there were definitely parts in the final dungeon where I remember just kind of thinking like, okay, are we done yet? And it just kind of felt like it kept going and going, and it definitely felt like a chore after a while. The other areas, like the other 5 main areas that you explore in the game, all felt like they flowed very nicely. Again, like I kind of alluded to this before, but the final, like I would say 5 hours of this game really feel like they almost could have been taken out. Like the final dungeon to me almost kind of felt like, and you can disagree with me on this if you want, that's fine, but I just felt like the final dungeon just almost didn't seem necessary. It just seems like they could have figured another way to tell this story, end it before that point, and still make it cohesive. I think I was right around the 40-hour mark when I got to the final dungeon and finally beat the game. It was like between 39 and 40 hours. So, yeah, and again, that's just my opinion. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that probably love the final dungeon, and if you did, great. For me, it didn't really do anything. But yeah, and as far as my overall thoughts for this game, so like I said before, this is easily one of my favorite RPGs in the Tales series, and in general among RPGs. The story is compelling, and the characters, mainly Alphen and Shion, had me genuinely invested in finding out the conclusion of the game. It's phenomenal, in my opinion, right up until the final dungeon, which, unfortunately, is where the game starts to falter slightly. And while I don't think it's terrible or ruins the rest of the game, it definitely had me wondering when it was going to be over. I felt like the developers could have trimmed down the final dungeon or figured out a way to make it a little more compelling. Also, given everything Alphen and Shion went through together, I guess I just wanted to see more between them in the end. But, as a whole, this is a game that greatly improves upon almost every aspect of previous entries in the Tales series. The amazing combat, in my opinion, more than makes up for the less than stellar ending. While this game doesn't quite stick the landing, this is still a fantastic game that deserves all the recognition it's received. And in case it's not obvious enough by now, it gets my full recommendation. Whether or not you're a fan of the Tales series or just love JRPGs or good games in general, I think you definitely owe it to yourself to get this game. It's easily worth the cost, in my opinion. Alright guys, I think that's going to conclude my episode for tonight. I think for the next episode, just to kind of give an announcement on that, I think what I might do is a review of the new Beavis and Butthead movie, because I plan on watching that this weekend. Can't believe I'm going to be doing a review of a Beavis and Butthead movie. But yeah, I think I might do it. It just kind of seems like it might be a fun thing to talk about, so look forward to that in the next episode. All right, everybody. Catch you all next time.